The Haunting of Blackthorn Manor. It was a dark and stormy night when Elizabeth first laid eyes on Blackthorn Manor. The old house stood at the end of a narrow, winding road, its stone facade cracked and weathered by centuries of neglect. Behind it, the shadowy outline of the Blackthorn woods loomed ominously, its twisting branches clawing at the sky. A sense of unease settled over her as soon as she stepped out of the car, the wind howling like a banshee, tugging at her coat. The once grand estate had an air of decay and dread, but she had no choice. This was her inheritance, and she'd come to claim it. Elizabeth had only learned of the manor's existence a month ago, after her estranged great-aunt Matilda passed away. She was the last of the Blackthorn line, and the manor had been left to Elizabeth, the only living relative. Growing up, she had heard vague stories about the Blackthorns, whispers of madness, disappearances and strange occurrences, but her parents had always brushed them off as rumours. The letter from the solicitor had been clear. She was now the owner of Blackthorn Manor. It was an opportunity too good to pass up, or so she had thought at the time. But standing there in front of the looming structure, she wasn't so sure anymore. The windows, dark and empty, seemed to watch her with malevolent intent. She shook off the feeling and walked up the cracked stone steps, key in hand. As soon as she stepped inside, a blast of cold air hit her. The smell of mildew and something else, something faintly metallic, filled her nostrils. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the vast entryway. The interior of the house was just as dilapidated as the exterior. Cobwebs hung from the high ceilings, and dust coated every surface. The furniture, though old and ornate, was covered in sheets, their ghostly forms adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Elizabeth made her way through the house, exploring room after room. Each one seemed to hold its own secrets. There was the library, filled with ancient leather-bound books, whose titles were worn beyond recognition. The dining room, with its long table set for a feast that would never come. And the ballroom, where cracked mirrors lined the walls, reflecting her uneasy expression as she passed. As the night wore on, the storm outside grew worse. Lightning flashed through the windows, illuminating the manor in brief, flickering bursts. Thunder rumbled, shaking the very foundation of the house. Elizabeth tried to settle into one of the less dusty rooms, a small parlour near the back of the manor, but sleep was impossible. Every creak, every groan of the old house set her on edge. The wind whistled through the cracks in the walls, and for a moment she thought she heard faint whispers carried on the breeze. She told herself it was just the wind, but deep down she wasn't so sure. Around midnight the storm reached its peak. The wind howled like a living thing, and the rain lashed against the windows with such force that Elizabeth was certain they would shatter. She was about to go upstairs to the bedroom she had chosen when she heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere deep within the house. Tap, tap, tap. At first she thought it was just the sound of the storm, but then she realized it was too regular, too deliberate. Her heart began to race. Grabbing the flashlight she had brought with her, she ventured out into the dark hallway. The sound grew louder, leading her toward the grand staircase at the center of the house. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from upstairs. Swallowing her fear, Elizabeth ascended the staircase, each step creaking under her weight. The tapping continued, steady and insistent, guiding her down a long dark corridor, lined with portraits of long-dead Blackthorn ancestors. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she walked, their expressions twisted with hatred, fear, or worse, anticipation. The tapping stopped as she reached the door at the end of the hall. It was a massive, ornately carved wooden door, one she hadn't noticed earlier when she had explored the house. Her hand trembled as she reached for the knob, a cold sweat breaking out across her skin. She hesitated for a moment, but something compelled her to turn the knob and push the door open. The room beyond was large, much larger than she had expected. The air was thick with dust and the overwhelming scent of decay. A massive four-poster bed stood in the center of the room, its curtains moth-eaten and blackened with age, but it wasn't the bed that caught her attention, it was what lay on the floor at the foot of it, a figure small and huddled, its back to her. Pale, skeletal fingers tapped rhythmically against the floor. Tap, tap, tap. She froze, her blood turning to ice. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence in any way, but the tapping continued, slow and deliberate. Her mind raced. Was this a squatter? Someone who had taken refuge in the house after her great-aunt's death? But no, this figure was wrong. Its proportions were off, too thin, too hunched. It looked inhuman. Summoning every ounce of courage, Elizabeth took a step forward. "Hello," she called, her voice barely a whisper. The figure stopped tapping. Slowly, impossibly slowly, it began to turn its head toward her. Elizabeth gasped, stumbling backward in horror. The figure's face was a twisted mockery of humanity, its skin stretched too tightly over its skull, its eyes sunken and dark. But it was the mouth that terrified her the most. It was stitched shut, the black threads pulling the skin taut into a grotesque smile. And then, in the dim light of her flashlight, she saw it, a glint of silver. The figure was holding something in its bony hand, a key, the very key that Elizabeth had used to unlock the front door. Before she could react, the figure lunged at her with unnatural speed. She screamed, turning to run, but it was too late. The last thing she felt was its icy fingers wrapping around her wrist, pulling her back into the darkness. The next morning the storm had passed, leaving the manor eerily quiet. The townspeople who ventured to the house to check on the new owner found it empty. There was no sign of Elizabeth, no indication she had ever been there at all, except for the front door, which stood ajar, and the rhythmic sound of tapping that echoed faintly from somewhere deep within Blackthorn Manor. The townsfolk whispered about Blackthorn Manor, sharing stories of its haunted history and the strange sounds that echoed from its hallowed halls. Some said the tapping was the restless spirit of Great Aunt Matilda, forever cursed to wander the halls of her former home. Others believed it was the vengeful ghost of a Blackthorn ancestor, a figure clad in ragged clothing and a stitched-up smile. Regardless of its origins, the tapping spread through the community like wildfire, adding more fuel to the manor's macabre reputation. Local children whispered about it on dark, spooky nights, and brave visitors dared to sneak past the manor's front door, only to be met with the eerie sound of rhythmic tapping, a chilling reminder of the horrors that waited within the manor's decaying walls. Legends sprouted, stories passed down from generation to generation, each more fanciful than the last. Some said the tapping was a warning for those who dared to explore the manor's shadowed halls. Others believed it was a lure, a siren song designed to draw unsuspecting victims into the heart of the Blackthorn's dark secrets. And so the Blackthorn Manor stood on the outskirts of town, its shadowed presence a reminder of the horrors that lay within its walls. The tapping continued, an ever-present reminder of the darkness that haunted Blackthorn Manor, waiting to claim its next victim. No one dares approach the manor after sundown, for the sound of those taps is a chilling reminder of what lurks within the depths of the manor's sinister halls. Story by Twing Down South.